December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest, Belgium, 0530 hours. A jeep rattles along a frozen road near Malmedy, its headlights cutting weak cones through freezing fog. 4 men sit inside, hunched against the cold, cigarettes glowing beneath steel helmets. They wear olive drab field jackets. They carry Thompson submachine guns. They speak English with flat, practiced American accents, complaining about the weather, about the coffee, about the war. To any American sentry who waves them through, they are simply more G is heading toward the front. They are not American at all. Beneath the borrowed uniforms are German soldiers, handpicked from across the Wehrmacht, trained for weeks in the mannerisms, slang, and habits of United States servicemen. Their mission is deception on a scale rarely attempted in modern warfare, to slip behind Allied lines disguised as the enemy, seize bridges over the Meuse before they can be destroyed, redirect traffic into ambushes, sever communications, and spread confusion so thorough that American units would begin shooting at each other. This is Operation Greif, the sharp edge of Adolf Hitler's last great gamble in the West. And within hours it will trigger one of the strangest side effects of the entire war. A wave of paranoia that sees generals interrogated at gunpoint and grown men forced to prove their nationality by naming baseball teams. Why any of this matters becomes clear only when you understand what was riding on it. Hitler's plan for the Ardennes offensive depended on speed. German armored columns needed to cross the Meuse River in days, not weeks, before Allied reserves could organize a response. A handful of intact bridges stood between the Wehrmacht and a genuine strategic breakthrough. Otto Skorzeny, the commando who had rescued Mussolini from an Italian mountaintop the year before, was ordered to make sure those bridges survived long enough for German tanks to cross them. What followed was a peculiar, improvised, often chaotic operation, one built on captured jeeps, mismatched uniforms, and soldiers whose grasp of American slang had been learned from prisoner-of-war camps and Hollywood films. It nearly worked, and the panic it caused would outlast the operation itself by weeks. By the 5th winter of the war, Germany's situation on the Western Front had become desperate in a way that raw courage could no longer fix. Allied armies had broken out of Normandy in the summer of 1944, liberated Paris in August, and by autumn stood along Germany's own borders. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, could barely contest airspace over the front line. Fuel shortages left panzer divisions immobilized in depots rather than fighting. Manpower, drained by years of attrition on the Eastern Front, was being replenished with teenagers and men pulled from desk jobs. Against this backdrop, conventional strategy offered no realistic path to victory. Hitler, increasingly detached from the military realities being reported to him, settled on a single throw of the dice. A massive armored thrust through the Ardennes, the same wooded, hilly terrain that had proven fatally weak in Allied defenses back in 1940. The objective was audacious, even by the standards of a desperate regime. German forces would punch through thinly held American lines, race for the Belgian port of Antwerp, and split the British and American armies in two, forcing a negotiated peace in the West that might, Hitler hoped, free Germany to concentrate everything against the Soviets in the East. The plan depended entirely on speed, and speed depended on bridges. The Meuse River represented the last major water obstacle before open ground toward Antwerp. If American engineers had time to prepare demolition charges and blow those crossings, the entire offensive would stall in the mud and snow of the Ardennes, exactly where German fuel reserves, already desperately thin, would run dry with nowhere left to go. Standard infantry tactics could not guarantee capturing bridges intact under fire. What was needed was something closer to sabotage than soldiering. Small teams who could reach those crossings ahead of the main assault, disguised well enough to avoid triggering demolitions before the German spearheads arrived. The scale of subterfuge required was almost unprecedented. Soldiers would need genuine American uniforms, real captured vehicles, functioning captured weapons, forged identification papers, and hardest of all, convincing English. Germany's pool of English speakers fluent enough to pass as native-born Americans rather than merely competent linguists was vanishingly small. The challenge on paper looked close to impossible. Command of this near-impossible task fell to Otto Skorzeny, already a minor legend within German military circles. Skorzeny ran his operation from a training ground at Grafenwöhr, and later from the Friedenthal facility near Berlin associated with German Special Forces, assembling what became known as the 150th Panzer Brigade, a unit built almost entirely around deception. Skorzeny's recruiters combed prisoner interrogation records, personnel files, and army units for any soldier with genuine exposure to American English, whether through emigration, prior residence in the United States, or simply an ear for accents. In practice, fluent speakers were desperately scarce. Estimates suggest that out of roughly 2,000 men eventually assembled for the brigade, only a small fraction, perhaps a few dozen, could pass sustained conversation with a native English speaker without arousing suspicion. The rest were sorted by ability into tiers, those who might bluff their way past a sentry with a handful of rehearsed phrases, and those whose accents were so poor they were kept away from any role requiring speech at all, restricted instead to driving captured vehicles or providing muscle in the rear. The technical heart of the operation was not a weapon in the conventional sense, but an entire fabricated identity, built piece by piece like a stage production mounted under combat conditions. Uniforms were gathered from prisoner-of-war stocks, from battlefield salvage, and from whatever captured stores could be scrounged. Vehicles posed a similar challenge. German industry produced nothing resembling an American Jeep, so captured Willys and Ford models were pressed into service alongside a small number of German Kübelwagens crudely modified with sheet metal paneling to approximate American silhouettes at a distance. Weapons followed the same logic. Captured Thompson submachine guns, M1, Garand rifles, and American rations were issued wherever available, both for practical use and for the visual authenticity of a search or inspection. Soldiers memorized details as mundane as American cigarette brands, the layout of a GI's wallet, and slang terms picked up from prisoners, all in the hope of surviving a casual roadside conversation with a genuinely suspicious military policeman. Briefings covered basic American customs down to how a serviceman might casually swear, spit, or address an officer. The sort of granular behavioral detail that separates a costume from a disguise. Training took place over barely 4 weeks, an impossibly short window to turn German soldiers into convincing Americans, and Skorzeny himself later admitted that many of his men would not have survived prolonged questioning by anyone paying close attention. The operation unfolded in the opening chaos of the Ardennes offensive, launched on December 16, 1944. Along an 80-mile front through Belgium and Luxembourg. Small teams from the 150th Brigade, typically traveling in groups of 4 in a single jeep, crossed into American-held territory in the confusion of the initial German assault, when front lines were fluid and communication between American units was breaking down under pressure. Some teams successfully redirected traffic at crossroads, sending American convoys down wrong roads, and adding to the disorder already gripping 1st Army headquarters. Others cut telephone wires, removed or reversed road signs, and spread false rumors among retreating American soldiers about German breakthroughs in areas that remained for now secure. A small number of teams were captured almost immediately, undone by the smallest details: a driver who did not know current American slang, a soldier whose paperwork failed to match questioning, a jeep spotted traveling in a manner inconsistent with genuine American traffic discipline. Once several infiltrators were captured and interrogated, word of the disguised teams spread through American lines within hours, and the psychological effect proved far larger than the operation's modest physical achievements. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Soldiers whispered that Skorzeny's men were hunting General Eisenhower himself, a claim serious enough that Eisenhower was reportedly confined to his headquarters under heavy guard for several days, unable to move freely, even behind his own lines. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. What followed was less a continuation of Operation Grafe than a self-inflicted crisis within the American Army itself. Checkpoints sprang up across the rear areas of the Ardennes front, and soldiers, terrified of infiltrators in their own uniforms, began interrogating anyone whose identity seemed remotely uncertain. Questions ranged from the capital of a soldier's home state to the identity of Mickey Mouse's girlfriend, to which baseball team had won the most recent World Series. Genuine American soldiers were detained, sometimes at gunpoint, for failing trivia they should have known, but momentarily forgot under the strain of interrogation. Even senior officers were not exempt. General Omar Bradley himself was reportedly stopped and questioned after correctly naming the capital of Illinois, but stumbling on a question about the position of a halfback in American football, a sport with which the general had little personal engagement. Compared with German attempts at similar deception earlier in the war, and even with the Allies' own occasional use of disguise and misdirection, Operation Grafe stands out chiefly for its ambition rather than its execution. The Waffen-SS had experimented with small-scale infiltration using captured uniforms during earlier campaigns, but nothing approached the scale of an entire brigade dedicated to sustained impersonation of an enemy army. On the Allied side, deception operations, such as the fictional 1st United States Army Group created ahead of D-Day, relied on physical decoys, misinformation, and double agents rather than soldiers passing as the enemy in direct contact with hostile forces, a comparatively lower-risk form of subterfuge. Operation Grafe's closest parallel may be found not in the Second World War at all, but in earlier commando traditions of disguise raiding, updated here with mechanized transport and radio deception. The brigade's practical achievements were modest. Only a handful of bridges saw any direct interference from Grafe's teams, and none of the operation's most ambitious objectives, seizing a Meuse crossing intact for the main armored advance, were achieved. Where the operation succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation was in the psychological domain, generating disproportionate fear from a genuinely small number of infiltrators, a ratio of anxiety to actual German soldiers involved that historians still find remarkable. Assessing the operation's legacy requires separating its material failure from its psychological success, two outcomes that sit uneasily alongside one another. Materially, Operation Grafe achieved almost nothing of what Skorzeny had been ordered to deliver. No major bridge fell into German hands through disguise alone, and the wider Ardennes offensive collapsed within weeks under the weight of Allied reinforcement, fuel shortages, and improving weather that returned Allied air power to the skies. Yet the operation's psychological shockwave rippled through the American army for the remainder of the campaign, consuming manpower and attention that might otherwise have gone toward the actual fighting front. Soldiers captured while wearing American uniforms faced a stark and immediate consequence, since the laws of war at the time held that combatants caught fighting in an enemy's uniform could be treated as spies rather than prisoners of war. A number of Skorzeny's men, captured in American uniform, were tried by American military courts and executed by firing squad within days of capture, a fate distinct from the ordinary treatment of prisoners taken in combat. Skorzeny himself was tried after the war at Dachau, where he successfully argued that his men had removed their American uniforms before engaging in actual combat, a defense that secured his acquittal on the specific charge, though the moral and legal questions surrounding disguised combatants remain debated among historians of the laws of war to this day. Surviving equipment and photographs from the operation can be found today in several military museums across Belgium and the United States, including artifacts held at the National World War II Museum and at Belgian collections near the Ardennes battlefields themselves, offering a physical trace of an operation that left a far larger mark on memory than on the war's material outcome. Return for a moment to that jeep on the frozen road near Malmedy, its 4 occupants speaking careful, rehearsed English into the freezing December air. They were, in the end, a small handful of men attempting something close to theater under conditions of mortal danger, wearing borrowed identities that might unravel with a single wrong answer to a single unremarkable question. Most of Skorzeny's infiltrators achieved nothing resembling their stated objectives. Bridges over the Meuse remained in Allied hands. The armored breakthrough Hitler needed never came. And yet the fear those few dozen convincing infiltrators generated spread through an army of hundreds of thousands, halting convoys, confining a supreme Allied commander to his own headquarters, and turning routine roadside stops into interrogations worthy of a courtroom. What Operation Greif achieved was not a captured bridge or a broken front line. It was doubt, seated deep inside an army that could no longer be entirely certain who stood beside it in the dark.